Good morning. As announced, I'm Canon Alan James, Canon Missioner for the Southern Region, representing the 22 congregations at this end of the diocese from Lake Michigan to here, and St. David's up in Lansing, from the Indiana border to roughly halfway between Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids. And I come bearing greetings, I can now say for the first time, bearing greetings from our bishop, Bishop Prince Singh, who arrived officially on scene Tuesday, and from the Standing Committee and the staff, giving thanks for your work here and your faith that you share in the community of Marshall and the parts around. We gather this morning not only as members of Trinity, but as members of the Diocese of Western Michigan, gathering with 7,500 other Episcopalians here in the western half of the Lower Peninsula at 54 congregations to share the same word and the same sacrament. So thank you for your ministry here in this time. 10 years ago, my wife and I had the fortunate reality that both of us were able to take a sabbatical during the same summer. And as a part of that time, we traveled to France for a week in Paris and a week in Provence. And driving around Provence, neither of us are big shoppers, so what did priests do? We look at old churches. And we learned about this one church in Saint-Trinit, a small, tiny, I don't even know if it's big enough to be a hamlet. I mean, it really is a wide spot in the road. It's so small, it's hard to find it on Google, but it is there. But we'd heard that they'd have a church that was built in 1100 with incredible acoustics. So we went. So we get there, and we're sort of like walking around, and I walk up behind the altar, square altar, and I place my hands on the altar, and I think about the start of the Eucharistic prayer, the Sursum Corda, the Lord be with you, and also with you. Lift up your hearts. We lift them up to the Lord. And this sense of the people who had been there, I mean, think about it. When we say 1100, that's to say that this church building had been built at the time of the Crusades. It existed for 400 years at the time of the Reformation. And it's still there. Still people gather in it to pray another 500 years after that. And this sense of its history, the prayers were palpable. I mean, for 900 plus years, people had prayed around at the time of the baptism of their young children, had gathered in time of literally a millennia of war to pray for loved ones. They'd gathered there for weddings and celebrations. That gathered to celebrate the life and to pray for God's grace in their grief when their loved ones had died. And in that moment, standing behind the altar and feeling all this prayer that was soaked into the walls, I felt so small because I was part of something so big. That our place as disciples of Jesus Christ, we are part of a large river that has been flowing for many years and will continue to flow after us. And again, so at first this made me feel very small and insignificant, but then it gave me a sense of confidence. My faith is not unique to me. It is something that I share with many. Paul gives voice to some of this connection. Paul, speaking to the Corinthians a mere few decades after Jesus' death, talks about handing on the things that had been passed on to him. He was continuing the story. He was sharing what he had heard and learned from others, what they had witnessed in their own life, in their own time, in their own now for us in our own generation. And this word witness is important because it connotes something about what we're called to do. You say, to be a witness, two things need to be true. You need to see something, you need to experience it, and you need to tell someone what you've seen and experienced. If you experience or see something and you don't tell anyone, you're not a witness. You're an observer. And if you tell folks something that is not based in something you've seen or witnessed or heard, then you're not a witness. You're a liar or a fiction writer. We are called to be witnesses. But Jesus says at his ascension, you will be my witnesses throughout Jerusalem and all Judea, to Samaria and the ends of the earth. That is to say to you and to me that we are Christ's witness in Marshall and all of Michigan, throughout all the United States and all points around the world. And so we gathered this morning, and I ask you, as in preparation for when we come to the prayers of the people, to think about who is it that has witnessed to you about God? Who is it that has shaped your faith, that in their time they told you in word and by their actions about God's presence and God's love, but the power and the truth of Jesus Christ? I think of my mom. I remember my mom when I was a young child, sort of peering in her bedroom window or bedroom door and seeing her lying on her bed with a phone with a cord attached to the wall, and her set of note cards, 3x5 index cards that had people's names written on it, because she was part of the intercessory prayer team. And so she was on the phone with her prayer partner, and they were praying for the people of the church and the community in need of God's healing. My mom, by her action, witnessed to the power of intercessory prayer. She was the one that taught me the Lord's Prayer when I was a young child, and the youngest of 3 boys, and my brothers would say it, and so I asked her. And so night by night, she would teach me one phrase of the Lord's Prayer until I could say all of it by myself. I remember T.R. McCracken, who was leader of the youth group when I was in high school. The time she spent with us just hanging out in the library of a church about this size, pool parties at her house, taking us on retreat up to the monastery of Society of St. Paul in Palm Desert. Her words, her teaching, her action about we were all loved. And how could we know that God could love all of us? Because she did. And even in the small youth group, I don't know that there were a dozen of us from about 4 or 5 families. I realized soon afterwards that this was my first experience of Christian community, not only because of the love that she shared, but I recognized that if the dozen of us had gone to the same school, we wouldn't have had anything to do with one another. We would have been in our separate niches and cliques, right? The smart nerd, the class clown, the jock, the in crowd. But at church, we all cared about one another. We still do. And when we heard about one of them passing away recently, all of us responded. We cared that each other was there. And it was actually one of the few places that we could come, and as much as we could as a teenager, we could lower the mask this much. But it is because of her faith, her witness, her investment in us, in me, that I knew and experienced the truth of God in my own life. On the Walnut Parish Hall are all the bishops. And Bishop Lee, a couple bishops back, was my priest when I was in college and helped me through a couple deep crises, including the death of one of my classmates. And an incredible story, I'll save that for another time where we can talk about it afterwards. But experiencing God's presence. And although I'd already been thinking about it in my junior year of college, he asked me, have you ever thought about being a priest? He was a huge part of my discernment because of his willingness not only to see me for who I was, but to share with me who he was and about his journey that led him to the priesthood. You have your own people. You did come here of your own free will this morning, but you made the decision because of the decisions and the sharings of people in your past. And I invite you to think about them. But this story doesn't end with us. It's our turn. It's our generation to take what we've learned, to take what we've experienced, to take what has been passed on to us like Paul, and to share it with others. To share it with our family members, our friends, our co-workers, and to share it with the strangers that God brings across our path. Now, our first defense, particularly as Episcopalians, is to say, who am I to do this? No, I can't do that. No. And what's interesting is that this is one of the few times in the lectionary there's a theme that runs through all three readings. Isaiah says, I am a man of unclean lips. I can't do this, God. Paul says, I am one untimely born. I have no right to be called an apostle, and this untimely born is a little bit sort of lost in the English translation. But as biblical scholars will point out, this phrase in its Greek connotes one who is born prematurely, which particularly in that day, when to be born at full term, you had a 50-50 chance of making it. To be born as a premature baby really was essentially to say, to be born, stillborn, to not live. That Paul was talking about his own really sort of anti-faith. He was persecuting the church. And yet, God still broke through. And then Peter in the gospel, right? The miraculous catch of Jesus coming and saying, whoa, I am not good. I am a sinner. So when you feel the tug on the one hand to sort of share your faith and you want to be reticent and you say, no, I can't do that, you're in good company. You're just like Isaiah, Paul, and Peter. So if we can get ourselves over that hurdle and not sell God short, because when we're witnessing, yes, we are sharing our story, our experience. And by the way, it is the one thing, we may not always get it right, but it's the one thing we're an expert on. But when we share our faith with others, God speaks through us. God speaks to the hearer to invite them and us into a deeper relationship with God. So I invite you now to not only think about those who have shaped your faith, but those to whom you can pass the story on. Your family members, your friends. To pray for God to offer you those opportunities and times when you can be a catcher of people. Go ahead and challenge God. God, I'll meet you halfway. You find the person to whom I'm going to talk to, and I'll be listening. I will be ready to give my witness, to share the stories of how I've experienced God's love and God's grace, to say to folks who are looking for a home, looking for a place to answer questions, to say, you might want to come to Trinity with me. Because here are a group of people who love me not because of who I am, but in spite of who I am. Here is a place and a community that has prayed with me and for me when I have been in a time of crisis. Here's a group of people who have said and pointed out what my gifts are when I am filled with self-doubt. Here are people through whom I have seen God's love and God's grace, and it is real. Come and see. Now, I close by saying one of the problems with American culture is we are too results-oriented. And if we don't know that things are going to turn out, we're not willing to commit to it. But nowhere in Scripture does it say that you and I are supposed to be successful. What we are called to be is faithful. Faithful in sharing our witness with others. I love, as I was telling the vestry yesterday in the retreat, I love the parable of the sower. You remember that's the story when Jesus is doing the teaching about the sower goes out and he casts the seed, and some of it falls on the path, and some of it in rocks, and some of it amongst the thorns, and bad stuff happens to all those. But some of it falls into the good soil and bears tenfold, hundredfold. And part of what I love about that parable is it's the parable of the sower. It's not the parable of the harvester. It's not the parable of the farmer even, but the sower. You and I in our witnessing are called to sow seed. Some of our witnessing will fall on deaf ears that will never be heard. Some of our sharing our faith will help people for a moment and then be lost. But that should not deter us from witnessing and sharing our story. Because some of our witnessing, some of our sharing, some of our inviting will fall on good soil. And our sowing the seed, planting the seed, will allow God to shine down like the sun and the water like the rain, and will bring great fruit. You and I are here this morning because people invested in sowing the seed in us. And now it is our turn, with God at our back, to go and sow the seed ourselves, to share what we have witnessed and what has been passed on to us, so that those to whom we share in this hurting and broken and searching world can find the God of truth and love that we know to be, that they might know God's peace, that they might experience God's healing. That is a good thing. Let us go and sow the seed that others might come to believe. Amen.